Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Literally Did Book Club for the month of September. We read Monstrilio by Gerardo Samano Cordova. Oh my God, everybody's got the book. I love that so much. Just a quick reminder, we are currently reading The Family Game by Catherine Steadman. And after that, we are reading Midnight is the Darkest Hour by Ashley Winstead. So these are the two things we're ending the year with. And then we're off for December and January, and we'll come back in February with an anthology that's been recently released that I haven't announced yet, but maybe you can guess what it is. And if you guess it, you're probably right. If you want to put in the chat a little, like whatever monster you feel like represents Monstrilio, go ahead and pop it in there if you read it. If you didn't read it, that's sad, and I think you should leave the live show and come back when you did, because we're going to spoil everything. If we want to start with introductions, I have a couple co-hosts here who kindly are joining me, and their links should be in the description. But if you want to tell us, I don't know, your name, your channel name, I don't know what you like to read. If you have any recent favorite thriller or horror books, I love to kick it off like that. You've both been here before. Especially like literary horror, because this is such a literary horror book. I feel like other people's book clubs, when they read horror, it's different than when my book club tends to read horror. So if you have any literary horror favorites you could recommend to people as we kick this off, I'd love to hear that.
Okay. Hi, I'm Stephanie from Stephanie Bookish, and I typically I kind of read everything, but I read a lot of horror and fantasy. I actually felt like the literary horror that matched this book the most was Our Share of Night, which I read recently and I enjoyed, only because it's told in parts and it switches perspectives. And then I also, for whatever reason, I think it's because the grief aspect really compared it to This Thing Between Us.
Oh, yeah.
And so those are two that I've loved recently as well.
Hi everyone, my name's Naomi. My channel is Naomi's Library. I as well read a bit of everything, but right now I'm like in my fantasy era at the moment. And some horror books that I've read recently that I really enjoyed were Looking Glass Sound by Catriona Ward. I really like that one. And then anything by Rachel Harrison. I love her. So I've read everything that she's put out. Like recently, I decided to read everything. So anything by Rachel Harrison. I'm not like a huge horror girly, so I'm very specific.
Yeah, she writes kind of like fun, cozier horror.
Yeah,
totally. I saw your review for Black Sheep, and it made me want to pick it up, even though I always give her 3 stars. You convinced me somehow.
Yeah.
Okay, if you actually let me do an intro. I'm Kayla. This is Books and Lala. I just want to share my most recent favorite literary horror is The Haunting of Alejandra by V. Castro, which I gave 4 stars. But me and horror have been like not getting along the most this year, so a 4-star feels really monumental. And then the other literary horror that I would recommend alongside this Monstrilio is Chlorine by Jade Song, because it's a coming-of-age literary horror. It's more grotesque, I would say, but in a totally different way, and has to do with a lot of like power dynamics between adults and children in sports. So there's that. Now, who wants to give me the intro of Monstrilio, the synopsis?
I got this. We're also we're reading The Haunting of Alejandra in my IRL book club, and I'm so excited that you liked it. I have not read anything, but I grew up with that like folklore. Is it La Llorona?
Yeah.
I grew up being scared of that, so I'm nervous. But anyway, yes, we read Monstrilio by Gerardo Samano Cordova. I grabbed like a little synopsis from a review that I was reading earlier. So we followed Santiago, who was the son of Mexican immigrants, and he was born in New York City with only one small misshapen lung. And he's not expected to survive very long, and he miraculously lives for 11 years. When death finally finds Santiago, his mother, Magos, cuts her son open with a kitchen knife and slices off a small chunk of his deformed lung before moving back to Mexico with her mother and leaving behind her husband, Joseph. Mago hears a folktale about a boy grown from a heart and acting purely out of instinct and desperation keeps the organ fragment in a jar and feeds it drops of chicken broth until it gains sentience. It grows hair, eyes, and a tail like appendage it uses to move around. Before long, Monstrilio emerges, not Santiago, but a furry blob that fills the space Santiago left behind. Monstrilio eventually becomes M, who resembles Santiago but with a patch of fur on his forehead and pointy teeth. Possessing brutal instincts, he must fight to control if he can. I always pictured him as like a bat because of the cover.
Me too.
Me too. And then if you guys listened to the audio and didn't have the physical book, there was a little doodle at the end. And I was so surprised by that. And I was like, oh, that's not exactly what I was picturing, but how adorable.
I guess the author is like he also does he's an artist as well.
Mm-hmm.
So he draws little creatures.
So cute. Okay, thank you so much. What was I going to say? Oh, I guess we should get into first just like ratings and just like a quick like one sentence explanation of your rating before any spoilers. Let me mix this up. What just happened? Well, I'm on the bottom now. I feel like the things are supposed to move when. Hold on, maybe I can get it back. Well, who knows? Okay, if you want to tell us your rating, I already did my wrap up, so I feel like I might as well just tell you. It was 5 stars for me. My explanation is that it was just to my taste. Like, it's literary horror. It was slow and sad. It was like surrealist in nature. It deals with grief, which is something I'm like often looking for. And it was really casually queer. It just did everything kind of perfect for me. But what's fun is I don't think either of you had this on your TBR. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but when I invited you to read this with me, and I've never done this before, because normally when I pick a book club book, I go on Goodreads and I see who has it on their TBR and I reach out to people. But this time I didn't see like anybody who had heard of it. And I was like, who do I think would enjoy this? And I just reached out. And so now I'm so terrified to find out if you loved it, if you hated it, and what your feelings are, and if you regret joining my book club. So you want to tell me? I'm ready.
I gave it a 4.5 stars. I actually gave it a 4.5 for similar reasons. I absolutely love and seek out books about grief. And so when I read the synopsis of this, I was like, oh yeah, this is going to be up my alley. And I did really like the way the perspective shifted and how you got to know this grief and these characters through different perspectives. I also just really love the writing so much. It was very immersive for me and it made me feel like very uncomfortable at times. So I think it just did all of the things that I love in literary horror, but also just horror generally.
Mm-hmm. Yay.
I also gave it a 4.5 out of 5 stars. I really, really liked it. I feel like I couldn't give it 5 stars because I don't think I've ever given like a horror 5 stars because I'm so specific with horror. But yeah, I really liked it. I loved the writing. Can't believe it's a debut because the writing was so good. But we'll get into POVs later. But I just really liked how it was sectioned. Like, I feel like the pacing was really good. I just had a really good time with it. And yeah, I do think it was also because I physically read it. I feel like if I would have only, like, I did both, but if I had only done audiobook, I probably wouldn't have liked it as much because I'm weird like that. So yeah.
Okay, well, it seems like there's such a mix of ratings, which is always very cool, but it is leaning pretty high, which is just great. I did a little poll. You can't see it from in StreamYard, but it looks like exactly 1/3 of the people here gave it 5 stars. 1/3 of the people here gave it 4 stars, and only 1/3 didn't read it or gave it under a 3. So I feel like this is one of our most successful book club reads of the year, considering it's not like, oh my God, horror.
Yeah.
I'm quite happy with that happening. Yeah, I listened to an interview with him and he was talking about all of his life journey and the jobs that he's had. He's like worked in the arts. He's actually in his 40s, which I didn't realize because he looks so young.
I know.
And yeah, so it's a debut. I'll ask at the end if you would read from him again, but I guess the answer at this point is probably yes. But I'll tell you later in the live show what he's working on because I did hear about that in an interview. So we're going to get into fully spoilers now. So if you haven't read it, hop out. You can see by the ratings that we did like it, so we would recommend it. Seemingly the chat as well, generally. So if you want to check it out and then come back, this live show will always exist here. My first question is, what perspective did you enjoy the most? Anybody who didn't like it, feel free to also like answer all of these questions in the negative. I want you to feel like you have the opportunity to share all of your thoughts. So if there was a perspective you didn't like, go ahead and tell us about that. But since I loved it, my questions gear positive. They're like, tell me everything that you enjoyed about it because I loved it so much.
I love the mom and M's perspectives the most. Those were the most engaging for me. And I think because her grief was so palpable, and then his grief about kind of existing and like having to exist in this box of what his family kind of expected of him and wanted from him. I really loved those two perspectives the most. I did feel like I gave it a 4.5 because the other two perspectives were a little bit weaker for me and I wasn't as engaged, but I still was really into them, if that makes sense.
Totally.
Yeah. Yeah, I really like the POVs because I feel like you were more biased, obviously, to like the person you were reading from. Because when you were reading from the mom's perspective, like you really understood. And then when my favorite was Lena's perspective, I liked the most because I feel like that was the first time that we saw like a switch from like the mom. You were kind of seeing like her grief and everything and how she was like I guess how she was coping with it, and then you got to see Lena's like outside point of view. I saw Jan say that she wanted more of like just the unhinged like grief throughout the whole book, but I feel like I got that most when it came to Lena's perspective, like seeing it from the outside, like her saying like she hasn't showered and like, oh, you cooked, like she doesn't do anything. But when you were in her perspective, you don't hear about any of that. She's just so focused on Monstrilio and how she's feeding him, and you're like, oh, she's like actually doing things. But then when you saw it from like Lena's perspective, I don't know, it felt more unhinged to me when you saw it from like the outside, someone else's perspective. But yeah, I liked Lena's the most. There wasn't any that I particularly like disliked. Monstrilio's specifically, or M's, I felt like I was reading like from the point of view of like Jeffrey Dahmer or something. Like it was so like that was the most unhinged, I feel like.
Yeah.
It was really disturbing, but yeah.
Yeah, I also agree with the comment that I just popped up. Starting with the mother's perspective and then ending with M was such a good choice because you also got to see, just like you said, the unhinged nature that bookended it, which was fun. I don't know that I had a favorite perspective. I guess sometimes I like to remind everybody who the characters were, and I forgot to do that. So we had the white ones are the perspectives that we got. So we have Magos and Joseph, who are the parents, and then they had Santiago, who passed, and then Monstrilio. And Magos has a friend named Lena, and they have a relationship throughout the story. And then we also have Magos's mother, Lucia, and her housekeeper, Jackie. And then on Joseph's side, we had Uncle Luke, who was his brother. And Joseph also got together with a man named Peter later in the book in his section. So those are the characters that we're talking about as a quick reminder of who everybody is. I don't know that I had a favorite. I feel like each perspective was my favorite while I was reading it. And then each one I felt like I wanted to continue. And every time it switched, I was like, oh, I wish, just like Jan said, I wish it got more unhinged with the mother. I wish that would, but then once I was in it, I was enjoying it so much. And there was something so necessary about each perspective. Like, I think especially Lena getting to know, because it's like, obviously you're going to follow the parents and that makes the most sense. And like the random perspective that's an outsider, it's kind of like, why are you going to the book wondering why you're going to get that? And I think it was so important to see a character who had been through hard things as a child. Like at one point, she says her mother tried to poison her. And I tabbed that and I was like, what the fuck? And so it just showed like how it made sense why we got her perspective and how we needed to see an adult who was treating Monstrilio in a certain way because of their own history. And then I didn't know that I needed M's perspective until I got it. Like as I was reading it, I was like, I read this kind of thing a lot, like creature horror, where you're not reading from the creature. Like how often do you really get that perspective? So I didn't think I needed it. And then once we were in it, I was like, oh, this is why it's so important to see him as an adult. And then it gets to bring in all of the adult conversations and storylines, and brings in so much other stuff going on. So I appreciated all of them once we were in them. My next question is, what themes did you pick up on and how did the book make you feel?
I mean, obviously the theme of grief, but I also think like with that theme of grief, there was a lot of trying to push people into boxes and to fit specific ideas that each character had for their different like partners. As you see in the beginning, like the couple is really struggling because this grief is tearing them apart and they're not really fitting into this idea they have of each other and how they should be grieving, especially, you know, when Magos decides to regrow the lung and people kind of disagreeing with her. She just can't understand like why they would disagree with this. And obviously people get on board later on, but I think especially for M, and I'm glad that we got his perspective, it was a lot of, because of their grief overtaking everything else, they didn't really understand or accept sort of who he was as M and who he needed to be able to thrive. And the fact that he at times, you know, would find himself killing somebody, and then being like, oh, it's fine. We can figure it out.
Right.
We got this. Like instead of accepting the fact that this is who he is and this is kind of what they've created, they're like, no, he's a normal boy. He can have a normal life. So I think the theme definitely was that grief and how that grief makes you interact with the people in your life. Which I guess is why I liked Lena's perspective too, because like Naomi was saying, you got to see kind of from a different point of view where she obviously was attached to M and Santiago, but it wasn't the same. So it made me feel really uncomfortable, especially in M's perspective, but also just the way that they would clean up everything and not really talk about the fact that he is a monster and killing people. So it definitely made me feel very uncomfortable and very like, I can't even describe it.
Yeah, I mean, obviously I agree with the grief theme in the novel, and as well as like how you were saying, Stephanie, I also feel like it was about like how I guess loved ones aren't really like replaceable. I feel like, of course, that was something that they were struggling like throughout the whole novel, and how they were basically trying to like replace Santiago with Monstrilio, and kind of how that bit them in the ass at the but yeah, I don't know if this is more of like a style rather than like a theme, but also like it was very folklore-ish, like the folk. I think that's why I also really liked it, because it really felt like I was reading kind of like from a storybook, and like, you know, like the original like Disney like stories are very like unhinged, and that it felt like that, like I was reading like a folklore, like a fairy tale type of book, like mostly at the beginning, and then we got M's point of view. But yeah.
That's so true. It's like a lot of surrealist books, I think, end up feeling fairy tale-y, because something that's fun about this is you don't necessarily get like every reasoning behind everything, and not everything makes sense. And it's kind of just like, would this really happen? Like he would kill all these people and all these animals, and they're just like, what? Just figure it out. It felt like almost kind of like goofy at times, like a little tongue in cheek. Like this is just so we're just gonna roll along with it, and that was really fun. The theme that I was thinking about was like the idea of love without strings or love without boundaries. And I think that that's something that you might connect with if you're a queer person in a family, if you are, you know, an adoptee. The idea of how far can I go before you stop loving me, and pushing that boundary. And obviously, it's so different because Monstrilio is actively a monster, and it's in his nature to do these things. And I don't know, it's just, I think it's interesting to think about how he wasn't doing anything on purpose. It was just how his life ended up being, and he was maybe not challenging on purpose, but seeing how far he could go with these people still supporting him. I also think that there's this idea of hunger, and I watched an interview with the author, and I think that he summed it up better. But he was talking about how there are so many hungers that we have in society that are acceptable, like ambition. But there are certain hungers like sexual appetite that are more taboo. And he wanted to explore those ideas. And obviously, like, it's just interesting because he's inherently monstrous. So you can't get mad at him for having this appetite. And that's what's so interesting about it to me.
Well, that's what's kind of funny with the grandma when he bites her and she gets really upset just because of who she is generally as a character, which you learn later on. And then they all come back together and they're like, yeah, it's fine. You know, I forgive him. It's cool. And they move on. And I also like what you were saying about acceptable hungers, because I did feel like you were saying, this is so casually queer, which I love in a book, but also there was a lot of sex on page, and sometimes that can make me feel uncomfortable if I feel like it's just trying to be gratuitous. But this felt so like inherent to this book in some ways that it didn't make me feel uncomfortable when we were getting these scenes. And I feel like that speaks so much to the casual queerness, because most relationships in here were queer. And I just really loved that aspect. And even Lena speaks to that as being almost like a found family who's also kind of in love with Magos and wanting to be together. I just really loved that aspect of the book as well, because it was so underrated, but also quite a huge part of the book. It's just not the forefront of it.
Mm-hmm. I think that transitions really well into the next question, actually, which is like, was there an element you believe could be improved upon? Since we all liked it so much, my perspective was thinking like, what do I think other people could not have liked about this? And the sex is something that came to mind for me. But I think while I was reading it, I thought it was really important to see, because I wasn't expecting a time jump at all. I thought, you know, I didn't know that much about the book, but I figured it was just going to exist in like a week or a month period where they grow this monster and then they have to kill it. And so the fact that it moved into Monstrilio or M as an adult, I really was not expecting, but I came to really appreciate it, because I think that you couldn't explore so many ideas about appetite with and hunger without him being an adult. And I also think it was so important to show, to have that creature as a fully aware person and not just a new monster and essentially a child. We needed to have the full arc of him, like having this awareness that what I'm doing is not acceptable by other people. And what am I going to do with that? Am I going to leave this family? Am I going to stay in it? Am I going to just go completely unhinged, or am I going to be reasonable? And I think we couldn't have explored that without him being an adult. Was there any element that you recognize that other people might not like, or that you think could have been improved upon?
I mean, I figured that perspective changes are such a hard thing for some readers. If you're not used to reading perspective changes, I think it could be really jarring and take you out of a book, especially if you hate a perspective more than others. And I did also think that the amount of sex that was in there might turn somebody off of this book as well. Oh,
okay.
Sorry, I was muted and I was just talking.
I was just looking at the comments. Sorry.
Very good. I was saying that I agreed with the POVs, and also to that, like, it didn't go back and forth. Like, it was just the one POV for a section, and then like it was the next one, and you never went back to the mom. Or and I know usually with like other books it's mainly like two POVs and you kind of go back and forth. So I feel like that would have been something that some people would have struggled with. And as well with like, it was definitely like a slower burn. I didn't feel like that, but I feel like other people would have thought that of the book, like a bit more of a slower burn if they're not very used to like the literary horror.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it seems like the perspective is what a good amount of people are mentioning. Okay, my next question is kind of why do you think the adults continue to protect Monstrilio? So throughout the story, we see him, attacking his grandmother, the animal, the dog, then kills a bunch of animals, and then eventually, spoilers if you didn't read the book, kills a human being by the end. And I think we've kind of gone through this, but if you have any other insight that you'd like to share, I just couldn't help but think like, do I think that the way these adults acted was like, I kept wondering, is this inherent to them? Is this the same way that they would react if Santiago had lived and they just had an adult child who was doing it? Would their reaction be the same? Or is it because they feel like an ownership of what they've created and a certain accountability? I just wanted anybody's thoughts on that.
Mine's not that deep. I just figured it was like, because if they admitted what he was doing or really faced it, then they would have to lose him all over again.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And because he's baby.
Yeah, my thoughts were the same. Like, pretty much like if they just like, they would have to kill him, which was like the discussion like at the beginning when he was just like a blob of like, let's just kill it off. So yeah.
Yeah, I think they just had to put their grief into something. That's what my takeaway, I guess, is that they had so many fractured relationships amongst themselves, and they had lost a child, obviously, that they couldn't take having this happen twice, and they had to put their grief somewhere. Their grief had to have somewhere to live, so they put it all into this child. I think that like we talk about nature versus nurture so much when it's just like young children, but not so much adults, and thinking about, were the adults predisposed to this kind of behavior, or is it something that they developed because they saw this creature grow? And I don't think there is like an absolute answer. I just think it's something interesting to talk about, because like it turned out to be like every adult was like, oh, Monstrilio, like whatever. Uncle Luke was like, you're fine. Like they all, and not all of them had grown up with him, or had seen him do the most horrific things, but there was just like this general support, which was just such a unique experience.
It was a little overwhelming.
Because if you think about, I don't know, like Frankenstein, which obviously has ties to this book, this is so the opposite of that. You create a monster and then you don't want anything to do with it, and you're like, oh my god, what did I do? In this one, it's like, well, we'll just figure it out, I guess.
Wait, sorry, someone said Uncle Luke was here for it. That was a character that was also very unhinged.
Yeah, right?
I also felt like the grandma was unhinged, but she was just quietly unhinged because it was like we didn't get a lot from her. But there were some characters in here that were older that I felt like, if we're talking about nature versus nurture, they definitely nurture this kind of behavior. Because if I were the grandma and I got bit, I would be like, no. So I feel like maybe it is kind of part of their character and how they were raised. Just from the very beginning, when you see the grandma, the way she reacts, she does initially get angry, but then she's like, we'll figure it out. It's fine. So part of me thinks that the characters are just kind of like this. And Joseph was really the only one within that family who really struggles and was torn between wanting to keep Em alive and wanting to do the right thing, which would be to not have him be alive anymore.
Yeah. I think that's funny that we look at it from such like a soft and comforting perspective too. We're like he was just so loved, but this is interesting because they're such so deeply selfish people in different ways. That's such an interesting way to think about it. Magos is unhinged, and she projects a lot of Santiago onto M, and that is a selfish situation. Okay, my next one is there any scenes or quotes that stood out to you specifically, like a favorite scene or anything that you want to share?
One that I always think about is at the very beginning when they're both grieving, and she says Magos is saying her husband is not dead, not sleeping, simply slack and raggy. She folds his fingers into his palms, prying them from their son's pajamas. And I don't know why, like, those lines in the beginning just really stuck out to me as like such a raw form of grief that I really related to, where it's like imagining how they're truly feeling in that moment before she makes this really life-altering decision, and how like raw and real it felt. And like the whole book felt that way, but the very beginning, especially when she's talking about their kind of relationship pulling apart and them eventually not being together anymore. And it just made me feel so incredibly sad, but I related to it really deeply. So that stood out to me. And then I think the ending generally, when Monstrilio sort of takes it upon himself to leave the situation and
Right.
understands that he can't exist in this box that they're putting him in, and that if anything, it would be safer for him not to, but also he kind of comes alive in that moment, because that's what they're describing at the end, or he's describing at the end, is how he knows his fur is going to grow back, and he knows he's basically going to become this wild creature again. So it just, those two parts were an interesting like dichotomy of grief for me, because it was like he's grieving this life that he was trying to have with his family, but really couldn't give them what they needed. And so he accepted what he was and what he had to do. And then in the beginning, like them losing him, it was really interesting.
Yeah, I highlighted a quote from Lena's chapter, and I think this is when she was talking about how like her mother like tried to poison her or something. Like she barely really briefly talked about it, but she said this thing, an actual fucking monster, was loved. And I just loved that when she was talking about how basically she had like nobody, and she had to like hire people to like wash her.
Right.
Is the yeah. And how like her and Magos like that didn't turn into anything. And she was just like this like monster is actually like loved by so many people. I think another scene that really stood out to me too was when they were talking about removing his like tail, and they asked Lena to do it, and she was like, no, I can't do that, and like she ultimately ends up doing it. Yeah, I really like that scene, and like that whole conversation about them talking about whether or not they should do it, and like if it would turn him into like an actual boy, and all this stuff. And then people were mentioning the uncle and the scene when he gets him the cow.
Mm-hmm.
I was like, that's such like a form of love, but also like, no, don't do that.
Yeah, that was wild.
Yeah.
Unhinged.
A lot of people are saying the performance, the art
Oh,
performance.
yeah.
Totally. I also tabbed a lot of things near the beginning. I feel like I have never been so like understanding of the grief so quickly in a book. Like I was already almost tearing up when she was talking about losing Santiago, and I just think that that is so impressive that he pulled that off, that description of grief. I tabbed something. I think my favorite quote was just again, like just like you said, Steph, at the beginning, when their relationship is just starting to fracture and they've just lost their child and they're talking about their grief. I highlighted the part where she said, I wanted him to snap, to finally and absolutely lose it, to break. He was withering. To wither is not the same as to break. To break is to have pieces to put back together, and to wither is to dry up, to wilt, to lose bone, to die, and death is the most boring. And I think that that's something that I relate to, not even in a grief way, but in an Aries way with a Gemini husband. I feel like sometimes I want you to lose it too, because I'm losing it and I need you to be on the same page as me, and you're too chill. Like you're dealing with things in such like a quiet way, and I'm such a loud person. And when I handle things, I handle them in an extreme way, in an external way. And that explanation of like seeing somebody else dealing with the same thing as you, but doing it so differently, just really spoke to me. There was also a part where she was talking about fear and anger, and those were the only two emotions that she had. And she said, the anger helped me wake up in the morning and eat and clean the house and wash myself. The anger even distracted me long enough that I would forget my loneliness. And sometimes in short bursts, I even felt cheerful. It was just like how she tied her emotions to how she was able to even exist in life. The other scene that got me is just when, for some reason, when M ate the bumblebee, there was like a part where he was drinking a cup of whatever it was. I don't even remember what it was. I don't think I even tabbed it because I was listening to the audiobook at that point. And it was just such an interesting point where he just like saw this bumblebee land in his drink and just immediately chugged it. And I was like, that's so funny. And it's like, to choose a bumblebee is so like cute. It's cutesy. Like it could have been any other bug, but a bumblebee.
It's like I want to
really
be
like
alive.
That's what it was. Yeah. Okay, so we're gonna wrap it up with the last couple questions. Will you read more from this author?
Yes.
Yes.
So I saw in an interview that he said he's writing a zombie book.
Oh.
And I can't, I haven't read enough zombie books, but like to imagine a literary zombie book is very interesting to me.
Yeah.
So I think I would read that.
Yeah, I feel like I haven't read any zombie books now that I'm thinking about it. So that sounds super interesting. I'm 100% on board.
Yeah. I'm so curious because I love zombie movies.
Mm-hmm.
But I have not read a zombie book before. Because I love The Last of Us, and I'm like, oh, is this what it's going to be like?
We read
that one movie?
We read Zombie Book for the Book Club, one of the first books read by Colson Whitehead. And not many of us liked it. So
take that off the TBR.
Okay, my next question is, what do you imagine life looks like for these characters after the book ends? Can you imagine their future, and what does that look like to you? Like, what are the relationships like? Like, where do you imagine them to be? Or are you somebody who finishes a book and you're just like, the book was the book and I don't leave it thinking anything else?
Not always. It goes back and forth. Do you want to go first? I feel like you have an answer.
I think the only thing that I was thinking about is I don't think Joseph and what was his name, Peter? I don't think they're gonna get married. I don't think the wedding ever actually happens for them. That was the only thing. But yeah, I don't usually really, for these type of books, I don't think I really like think too much about like what happens after. I feel like I have to be like super invested in like a fantasy series or something like that to be thinking like that. But yeah, or definitely getting divorced if the wedding does happen. Because I feel like potentially would have been like the conversation of like, where's M? And then he just tells him everything. And then it just never happens. But I don't know.
Yeah, I feel like Joseph, I think he extricated himself from the situation, all situations, hopefully, because he's, for lack of a better word, he's such a pushover. He can't make a decision to save his life. I hope that Lena like went on her way. I hope they just like split apart from each other because that was a toxic situation. And I'm sure Uncle Luke is just carving up cows or something weird.
I too am not somebody who really tends to think about characters after a book ends. Like the book is just the book. But for some reason, there was so much drama in all of these relationships that I couldn't help think about it and want like a good future for everybody. It's funny because in the interview that I watched with the author, one of the audience questions was something about Joseph and Peter and like how, like why Joseph never told Peter the truth about M, like how he never revealed it and how that was killing people. And Gerardo said that it's just funny how like perspectives are different. Like the author in interviews, you can really tell like he loves Joseph and Peter together. Like I think the way that he has in his mind is that Peter is just like this perfect reprieve for Joseph. He never needs to share that part of his life with Peter because it's just different. He has to separate himself. And I think, yeah, he like imagines them together. And I interpret it so differently. Like I'm just like, they're not the right ones for each other. But I also am not like a Joseph and Magos purist either. I don't think that they're perfect together. I do think that I imagine Magos and Lena together in the future once maybe they both have healed. I think that I could imagine them together as like older women. And I too, just like everyone else, thinks that Emma's just in the woods. You know, he's living forever and he's living his best life. And it's not his fault that his life went this way. He was created. He didn't choose this. And he is not killing people, but he's found sustenance in animals, and he just gets everything that he needs.
He's a Colin now. Maybe the whole Magos and Lena thing, it's like her mom and the housekeeper, because wasn't that like yeah. So
I can't remember if it was implied or if it was specifically said.
I feel like it was more implied, but I don't know. Yeah. I feel like I just felt bad for Peter because I was like, this man's being lied to. Joseph isn't even excited about him getting like engaged. So I'm like, he's not even telling people. So I'm like, Peter deserves better.
Yeah, I feel the same way. Like I felt like Peter, poor guy, didn't even know.
Yeah, Joseph needs a lot more healing before he can find his proper life, I think. My final question for everybody that I always like to ask is, are there any books, movies, or shows that you would recommend? Either if people liked this or disliked it, like what else would you suggest people pick up? My first one, because I already pulled it up, is Frankenstein. Do you guys have any?
I think I said in the beginning, I did feel like Our Share of Night only because of the casual queerness, the way that it does shift perspectives, and it's very much about a son trying to navigate parental relationships and maybe lack thereof of good parental relationships. It's also very unhinged. And this thing between us, because it really deals with grief in such a unique way. And I did feel like this book for me was such a unique experience of grief that I hadn't really read before.
Yeah, I feel like this book was so specific. I don't think I've ever read anything like it, but the one movie that it gave me a lot of similar vibes is one of my favorite, like, I would say it's more like psychological horror. It's called The Orphanage, but it's from Spain. So it's El Orfanato. So I watched in Spanish when I was little, but it's like, and it's a really, really great film. It's like from 2007, and it's basically about this mother who has a child. I think he has diabetes, and he goes missing, and then like she knows he has to be dead because he doesn't have like his insulin and stuff, and all of the things that she goes to, like all the measures she goes to find him, and like and all the grief and everything. It's more like psychological horror and like spooky, like ghosts. But I love that movie. It's like one of my favorite.
Nice. The comments have Night Bitch, which I definitely agree with. If you want that really unhinged mother in a literary horror, and it has like also the performance vibe that Magos had going on, that one would be a good recommendation. Frankenstein. Sorry, I woke up with a little bit of a cold. I think I'm handling it okay. Nesting by C.J. Cook, I've also heard of. I don't fully remember the plot. The Metamorphosis, that's a good one. Oh, I've never heard of this. Okay. Our Share of Night, for sure. I think that was a great recommendation. Pet Cemetery. Always Under the Sea, if you want a literary horror, for sure. That one's lighter, generally. Yeah, more about the monster. Yeah, that's an interesting way to put it. The Hatching. Okay, so the one... Actually, these were not from me. Again, like I watched an interview with this author, and all of his answers for the questions, I was like, I'm just going to say that because like he has a good handle on his own book. But he said specifically these two were some of his favorite things to read. Fever Dream by Samantha Schweblin is definitely more vague and strange than Monstrilio. It doesn't have a clearly defined like evil character necessarily. It's just like weird. So that one is one that I gave 5 stars. And then I haven't read this one yet, but it's on my shelves. And he said that he's currently reading this. And as he was reading it and writing this book, there's actually a couple stories in here that like reminded him of the themes in Monstrilio. It's called The Dangers of Smoking in Bed by Mariana Enriquez, who is the same author as Our Sheriff Knight. So I definitely need to bump this one up on my TBR. And I think that's pretty much it. Thank you, everybody, for being here for the live show. Thank you for making the time. A reminder again, the next 2 books that we're going to be reading are mystery thriller things for the end of the year, which I think is going to be fun. Something that I realized actually this year, because I like to mix up the mystery thriller and horror books that we read throughout the year. Obviously, we've had 3 horror books this year, and I realized that they've all been by men. So that's something that I just noticed, and I was wondering, you guys can, anybody can message me independently or leave a comment after this video. But if you have any horror written by women that I haven't already read that you think would make for a really good live show discussion, I would love to hear about it, because clearly I haven't been prioritizing that by accident. So I would love to hear any 2024 releases that you know about next year. If you want to leave those in the comments for me to peruse, I would love your suggestions. And thank you guys for being here. I'll see you next month. Bye.